top.
Yeah, you know what? There's a historic pattern of, in sort of troubled economic times, this stuff really takes hold, and some of it is, I think, just strictly a ploy by the right to garner kind of enthusiasm for their platforms and their electoral politics. And it's, this is an age-old pattern that when times get bad, people are ready to find somebody to blame, and there's a lot of rage, and people channel it into immigrant groups and minorities.
Yep. Yeah, it's amazing to me that the neoconservative movement, which it isn't just Frank Gaffney, it's the whole neoconservative movement, or much of the neoconservative movement that's in on this, domestic Muslim bashing and fear-mongering stuff. And it's just amazing to me with how paranoid these guys are that they can't see the danger they're putting themselves and their own friends in. You don't really want people choosing whether they respect you or not based on who you are, do you? Does anybody want that, Yeah,
I saw this funny, this neocon organization put out this film that I don't want to give publicity to, but basically the theme of the film talks to a bunch of Christians in Israel, and it's basically, a plea for Western Christians to support Israel. And what it's saying is that first the Muslims in what is now Greater Israel, which includes Israel proper and the occupied territories, first the Muslims will come for the Jews, and then they will come for the Christians there. And it's true that can easily be reversed. And you look at some of the neoconservatives and some of the most hardcore Muslim bashers, and you say, first they're going to come for the Muslims, and then they're going to come for the Jews.
Yeah, in American history, it hadn't always been the easiest thing to build a Jewish temple in this country, and now stop the mosques. I kind of get a kick out of it, Ali, honestly, the idea that there's this, secret Sharia takeover thing. It's like the second Red Scare to such absurdity, you know what I mean? Repeated as such a farce. Well, yeah. Here's a group of people if they're a group at all, there's no such thing as that, but you know what I mean. Muslims in America have no political power at all. There's one congressman, and he's got no power at all.
Yeah, it is pretty amazing. I mean, there's been a lot of talk. Dershowitz recently has been promoting a book by one of his acolytes that's called The Arab Lobby, and I mean, this is just laughable as a kind of counterpoint to the Israel lobby. It's absurd to think that there's that much clout on the Arab and Muslim side of America. It's really quite absurd. But on the specific point of these Sharia reports by Frank Gaffney and the Center for Security Policy, Dan Lubon's done a little bit of writing about it on our site, but I also really recommend that your listeners at Antiwar Radio go and check out a writer whose name is Matt Duss, who writes for Think Progress and many other outlets, and he's done some great work on the Center for Security Policy.
What's his
report.
last name again, Matt?
Duss, D-U-S-S.
Okay.
And so I'd recommend checking out his work. You can tell he's doing well because he's been attacked by the authors of the report repeatedly. So he's really hitting some sore points. And he basically went to their release party on Capitol Hill and asked some questions. And it turns out that these guys know nothing about Islam. Here they are writing about Sharia and all its terrible implications for America. And the only person on the report who knows anything about Islam readily admits that he only started looking into the faith 3 years ago. They didn't consult any even quote-unquote moderate Islamic experts, Islamic law experts, or anyone. They're just kind of pulling it out of the nether and putting it down as this great massive threat to America.
Yeah, it's amazing. I'm going to actually set up an interview for next week with a guy who knows a little bit about this. I always like to attack the right from the right and the left from the left if I can, And I was reminded of something that was put out by G. Edward Griffin, who's a bit of an old bircher and the author of The Creature from Jekyll Island. And he put out this thing right after September 11th, or I don't know, maybe spring 2002 or something. And it was called, Nah, man, don't worry about Islam. Islam's cool. And here's a guy who's a John Bircher, right? He believes in Jesus. He's I believe, a Protestant of some description or another, and loves the American flag almost as much as he loves Jesus. And obviously, he's a Bircher, right? And he goes, nah, man, look, the Koran, he knows the Koran. And he's like, look, all these passages about kill the Christians, it's one specific instruction on the eve of a battle. You know, he wasn't Jesus, Muhammad. He was a warlord, but this was a specific thing about a specific time and place. And you turn the page and you see that the Muslims who lived with Muhammad to his dying today lived in peace and harmony with Jews and Christians in Arabia and in that whole area. And, and he just goes on, and I'm no expert or whatever, but it's clear that you could just as easy take something completely out of context, out of the Old Testament, maybe even in context, and use it as an excuse for something terrible. But the idea that somehow Islam is bent around this imperial philosophy of conquering North America or something is just not there. It never was. If anything, you look at bin Laden, Michael Scheuer says, he's an Arab nationalist. It's only very recently he's even bothered to mention Turkey. His whole point really is Arab nationalism and get the hell out of here where our kind are, not necessarily by religion, but by ethnicity,
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that much about the nuances and history of bin Laden's views, so I better stay away from that. But I think that you certainly got something with the larger point that, the vast majority of Muslims, not only in the U.S. but worldwide, are not extremists, just as the vast majority of just about any group are moderate and tend to live in peace. It's generally a small minority that works hard to rile up populist movements against these groups. And as I say, it usually occurs in economic downturns, which is what we have here in the U.S., and you see it manifested in this Muslim bashing.
Yeah, especially it's ironic to see is 9 years later, like that mosque in Tennessee, in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, they never had a problem for 30 years. They never had a problem after 9/11. I think I even heard one of them saying, I think it was the same mosque, that people came by and said, hey, we understand. We love you guys. You're part of our community and whatever. It's cool. And then now 9 years later, Gaffney says jump, and David Horowitz in like the lowest part of the neoconservative movement says jump, and all of a sudden there's arson and protests and all these things. 9 years later, and nobody even attacked Tennessee. It was New York that was attacked and Washington, D.C. that were attacked that day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right, and that sort of also exposes one of the fallacies of the Muslim bashers in the case of the so-called Ground Zero Mosque, is that it's not just about the fact that this is 2 blocks from Ground Zero, because you see all these other mosques in other places being harassed regularly, as part of this broader Islamophobic campaign, and so that's just not. That Murfreesboro, Tennessee mosque, as you say, should be waved in the faces of anybody who says this is about sensitivity to the family members who lost people on 9/11. No, that's not what it's about. It's much broader, and it's gaining support in other small places all around.
Yeah, well, and I happen to know someone who lost some very dear friends that day, and she happens to really resent her friends' lives being exploited like this to bash other helpless people. So as far as respect for the loved ones, consider it the opposite. But now, back to the subject of Iran and the talking points. I mean, you guys are doing some of the best work in the country in pushing back against these neocons and their lies. But is it working? I mean, as you survey all these studies, and you do all these studies every day, all of y'all over at the LobeLog, and you kind of look around the major papers and the neocon papers and everything else. Does this echo chamber still just completely rule the debate? Will we ever have honesty about Iran in the public discussion at all until it's too late, or what?
I'm pretty convinced that at this point Obama is trying to really make progress on the dual track of sanctions and diplomacy. I don't see an immediate bombing of Iran in the offing. I think that depending on what happens in 2012, those chances could certainly skyrocket all of a sudden, but there's also this wild card that Jeffrey Goldberg has discussed about an Israeli strike on Iran. And I don't know where things are going. I hope that our little corner of the internet is making a difference in showing that this is a campaign that we've seen before, and I can't gauge things. There was this, we wrote about it on LobeLog, this Chicago Council on Global Affairs poll, which came out, and something like only 18% of Americans supported the idea of bombing Iran right now. And interestingly, even if sanctions and diplomacy were to fail, I think it was 49% still oppose bombing Iran compared to 47% who would then support it. So it seems that in the U.S. there is some, if not a majority, of the population that would be willing to take on some sort of containment policy against even a nuclear Iran, which I don't think is a situation that anybody wants to see. But frankly, I think the alternative of attacking Iran ahead of what nuclear weapons capability or actual nuclear weapons, attacking them on that basis, I think would unleash sort of a massive blowback that would just be incomprehensible. And so yeah, I mean, I think that there are some promising things, but certainly Obama has acquiesced to escalating measures such as the latest rounds of sanctions. I think to a great extent, Cliff May wrote this, who's a neocon with the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. He's actually the president of that group. He wrote an article in National Review probably about a month and a half ago when there was this report released about economic warfare with Iran, and it was a map for what Cliff May called Sanctions Plus. And he noted that FDD fellows, as well as other members of the task force that had created this report, had been into Congress to brief congressmen as they were writing the sanctions package into U.S. law. So, that just shows that neoconservatives are still around. They're still getting into the halls of Congress. They're still helping to write legislation. And unfortunately, this is legislation that passed and then Obama signed. So essentially he's signing a neoconservative escalation package against Iran. And so there are trouble.
You kind of got to hand it to them, man. I mean, these guys are the Energizer bunnies of lies and death. They just never stop. Not for a day, not for one breath do they stop.
Yeah, they're motivated. I mean, I think that they're ideologically motivated, and yeah, I mean, I think to some extent, I think they're wrong, but I think that they are to some extent very much true believers, and they want to get their message out there.
You know what I'd like to do is have a big kind of mandatory teach-in like at Clockwork Orange, where we just tie down the entire press corps in New York and D.C. to their chairs. Like in that movie War Inc., where they wear like the 3D goggles or whatever to do the airstrikes along in their embedded microchip in their head. Anyway, and we tie them all down to their chairs, and we force them to learn about what it means to have an additional protocol to your safeguards agreement, and we just take it that they're all guilty of complete and total ignorance about anything regarding nuclear technology or the treaties involved and the international laws and UN resolutions involved in that conflict. And then we'll just force them to sit there and read everything Gordon Prather ever wrote 700,000 times. And then we'll turn them loose and let them go back on TV and talk about Iran again. Because otherwise all we're going to get is, oh, Iran's scary, and then a commercial.
Yeah, it's a good idea, Scott, but unfortunately, a lot of this information is already at their fingertips, and I think that there's some willful ignorance about it out there. I'm not sure that sitting them down and making them listen to it would get it into their thick skulls anyway.
Yeah, well, that's why I'm talking about tying their eyelids open and, making it extremely unpleasant. But
sort of enhanced interrogation techniques, but the opposite, enhanced learning techniques, let's call it.
Right. Well, I'll tell you what, we'll let them come up with the euphemism for it. It'll be perfect.
Yeah, it's not a bad idea.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, hey, 3.6% versus 94%, that's really not that difficult. One is not weapons grade. The other is weapons grade. And what they got ain't weapons grade. That's, come on. Even a fifth grader ought to be able to wrap their head around that. Even a CNN news anchor ought to be able to wrap their head around that, right?
Oh, I think you give CNN too much credit comparing their anchors to fifth graders.
Yeah, well, that's probably true. Any fifth grader worth of salt wouldn't come anywhere near a place like CNN. And in fact, the few news people that I've met in person in my life are completely unimpressive. They're basically the pretty people from high school who wanted to be on TV or whatever. They don't